Listen, the silence of a dead ranch in the middle of a late-season May blizzard is a sound that haunts a man's sleep for decades. A heavy, suffocating pressure that tells you everything you've built is slipping through your frostbitten fingers. Caleb Miller stood in the center of his calving barn, the dim glow of his headlamp cutting through a freezing mist that shouldn't have been there, reflecting off the glassy eyes of a Charolais heifer struggling in the dark. It was the first week of May, a time when the Nebraska plains should have been waking up with the scent of damp earth and new grass. But instead, a freak atmospheric collapse had throttled the region with 3 feet of heavy, wet slush and a wind that screamed like a banshee through the corrugated steel. The power grid hadn't just flickered, it had surrendered. The main lines miles away snapped like brittle twigs under the weight of the ice. Caleb had done everything right, or so the brochures told him, having spent $80,000 the previous summer on a state-of-the-art, Tier 4 final, computer-controlled standby power system that was supposed to bridge the gap between disaster and survival. But as he stood over the control panel of the massive, sleek-housed Titan Series generator, all he saw was a flickering red LED and a cryptic error code 404 communication fault blinking back at him with cold, digital indifference. The sensors meant to protect the engine had become its executioners, refusing to let the motor turn over because a handful of frozen urea in the DTF tank had triggered a software lockout that no wrench or prayer could bypass. The stakes were higher than just a dark house or a cold kitchen. Caleb had 47 heavy cows moved into the nursery wing, their bodies steaming in the drop of temperature, their biological clocks indifferent to the failure of the local utility cooperative. Without power, the automated ventilation fans stayed stagnant, allowing deadly ammonia and moisture to build up in the rafters. Without power, the infrared heating lamps, the only thing capable of drying off a newborn calf before its lungs crystallized in the 10-degree air, were nothing more than expensive glass ornaments hanging from the ceiling. He had tried the dealer, his fingers fumbling with a cell phone that was rapidly losing its own battle with the cold, only to be met with the flat, rehearsed tone of a service manager 50 miles away in a warm office. The man had told him that the logic board had likely suffered a surge before the blackout, and that a technician couldn't be dispatched until the county plows cleared the main arterial roads, which could take 3 days. 3 days was a death sentence. To the dealer, it was a warranty claim and a logistical headache, but to Caleb, it was the sound of 47 heartbeats slowing down in the dark, a potential loss of over $60,000 in future livestock, and the total humiliation of being the miller who let the legacy freeze out of existence because he trusted a computer more than his own hands. He felt the sting of tears that instantly turned to ice on his lashes, not just from the cold, but from the sheer, helpless anger of being locked out of his own machinery. He had the fuel, he had the oil, and he had the mechanical knowledge passed down through 3 generations, yet he was defeated by a line of code he couldn't see and a sensor he couldn't fix. The barn was getting colder by the minute, the heavy, wet slush of this miserable May storm hammering against the roof like a funeral drum. And the first of the heifers began to moan, a low, guttural sound of labor that signaled the clock had finally run out. He looked at the high-tech, silent monolith of the Titan generator and realized it was nothing more than a monument to modern arrogance. He was alone, cut off from the world, watching the humidity from the cow's breath turn into a deadly rime of frost on the gates, knowing that by daybreak he'd be dragging carcasses into a pile instead of tagging healthy ears. His neighbors were in the same boat, their silhouettes invisible across the white-out fields. All of them victims of a grid that failed, and a technology that required a high-speed internet connection just to start a diesel engine. Caleb kicked the side of the silent machine, the dull thud mocking him, and for a moment he considered just sitting down in the straw and letting the cold take the sting out of the failure, until he remembered a shape under a rotted canvas tarp in the back of the old machine shed, a piece of iron that hadn't seen the sun since his grandfather was buried. The crunch of frozen slush under Caleb's boots sounded like breaking glass as he fought the gale toward the secondary shed, his mind racing through the brutal arithmetic of a rancher's debt. These 47 calves represented more than just the next generation of his herd. They were the focal point of a bridge loan he'd taken out to keep the Miller name on the gate after a blistering drought the previous summer. If he lost this crop, the bank wouldn't just be knocking, they'd be bringing the padlocks, and the legacy of 4 generations would be auctioned off in a single afternoon at the county courthouse. The pressure felt like a physical weight on his chest, heavier than the snow piling up against the barn doors, made worse by the persistent vibration of his phone in his pocket. It was the regional service manager for the generator company, a man named Henderson who sounded like he'd never seen a day of dirt in his life. Henderson wasn't calling to offer a solution. He was calling to offer a warning, his voice crackling through the intermittent signal like a snake in the grass. He told Caleb that if he attempted to bypass the digital lockout or tinker with the logic board, the 3-year extended warranty would be instantly voided, leaving Caleb on the hook for the full $20,000 replacement cost of the control module. It was a cold corporate ultimatum. Stay in the dark and watch your calves die to save the warranty, or try to fix it yourself and lose the only safety net you have left on a machine that doesn't even work when you need it most. Caleb didn't even give him the satisfaction of an argument. He simply let the phone slip into the snow, the screen glowing for a moment before the cold snuffed it out. He didn't have time for corporate liability or the hollow promises of men who worked in climate-controlled skyscrapers. He reached the heavy timber doors of the old machine shed, the wood swollen with moisture and protesting with a scream of rusted hinges as he heaved them open. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of ancient grease, mouse nests, and the peculiar, sweet scent of oxidizing iron. This was the graveyard of the ranch, the place where things went when they were too broken to use but too sentimental to scrap. His foreman, a weathered man named Silas, who had worked for Caleb's father and was currently hunkered down in the main barn trying to keep the heifers calm, had told him an hour ago that they should just start the tractor and hope the heater in the cab could save at least 1 or 2 of the calves. But Caleb knew the math. 1 tractor cab wasn't a nursery, and 47 calves needed more than hope. They needed 300 amps of steady, unwavering power to drive the blowers in the heat coils. The conflict gnawed at him. Every minute he spent digging through the past was a minute he wasn't tending to the laboring mothers. And the skeptics in town, the ones who said Caleb was too focused on the old ways, would have a field day when they found out he'd lost the ranch trying to play mechanic in a blizzard. The shadows in the shed seemed to lengthen as his headlamp flickered, casting long, distorted shapes against the walls. He pushed past a rusted disc harrow and a stack of rotted hay bales until he saw the silhouette he was looking for. It was a 1954 Fairbanks Morse stationary power plant, a massive cast-iron beast that looked more like a steam engine than a modern generator. It had been his grandfather's pride, a machine built in an era when planned obsolescence wasn't a phrase and software didn't exist. It was a hunk of pure, unapologetic engineering, but it hadn't turned over since the bicentennial. The neighbors had laughed when Caleb refused to scrap it 5 years ago, calling it a boat anchor and a waste of floor space. Now that boat anchor was the only thing standing between the Miller Ranch and total insolvency. The deadline wasn't tomorrow or even in a few hours. The first calf was already crowning, and the temperature in the calving barn was plummeting toward 0. Caleb grabbed a tattered rag and wiped a layer of grime off the brass manufacturer's plate, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had no manual, no tech support, and no way to call for help. He was gambling the entire future of the farm on a machine that was older than his father, hoping that the ghost of 1950s American manufacturing still had enough spark left to fight off a 21st century disaster. The ice continued to build on the roof, the weight of the storm threatening to collapse the very structure around him as he reached for the massive hand crank buried in the dust. The 1954 Fairbanks Morse wasn't just sitting there, it was a tomb of frozen, stagnant engineering that felt as though it had become a singular, solid piece of the Earth's crust, fused together by 50 years of neglect and the creeping damp of the Nebraska aquifer. Caleb threw his entire weight against the massive iron flywheel, his boots sliding in the oily muck of the shed floor, but the machine remained an immovable object in the face of his desperate force. It was a different kind of failure than the one blinking on the Titan screen. That was a digital ghost, a phantom in the machine. But this was the cold, hard reality of physics. He knew the rings had likely oxidized themselves to the cylinder walls, creating a molecular bond that no amount of raw muscle could break. He looked at the shadows dancing on the wall, and for a second, he saw his grandfather's face. A man who didn't know what a logic board was, but knew exactly how to talk to iron. Caleb didn't have a diagnostic tool, but he had a propane torch and a can of penetrating oil that looked like it had survived the Korean War. He began the slow, methodical process of cooking the engine, bathing the massive cast iron block in the blue-orange roar of the torch, watching as the rime of frost turned to steam and then to a weeping black sweat of ancient grease. The smell was overpowering, a cocktail of burnt petroleum, scorched dust, and the ozone of the storm. But to Caleb, it was the smell of a fighting chance. He spent 45 agonizing minutes moving that flame over the cooling fins, his own breath coming in ragged gasps that mirrored the whistling wind outside, until finally he heard it. A microscopic tink of metal expanding against metal. The technical pivot wasn't just about heat, it was about the spark. Even if he freed the piston, the Fairbanks was a magneto-ignition beast, and decades of humidity had likely turned the internal points into a corroded mess. He didn't have a replacement, and the dealer, the same one who had warned him about his warranty, didn't stock parts for anything built before the moon landing. He had to improvise. He tore a strip of emery cloth from a workbench that was more termite dust than wood, and began the delicate, maddening task of cleaning the contact points inside the magneto housing by the flickering light of his dying headlamp. His fingers were so numb they felt like wooden pegs, lacking the tactile feedback needed for such precision work. Yet he moved with a frantic grace born of pure survival instinct. He thought of the 47 calves, the future of the herd that was currently shivering toward a quiet end in the nursery wing, and he realized the irony of his situation. He was using a piece of sandpaper and a blowtorch to do what an $80,000 computer system couldn't. He wasn't just fixing a generator, he was performing a mechanical exorcism. He drenched the intake in a prayer's worth of starting fluid, his heart hammering a rhythm that matched the gale-force gusts rattling the shed's tin roof, and he stepped back to the flywheel. This was the moment where the story either ended in a quiet auction or began a legend that the county would talk about for a century. He gripped the heavy oak handle of the crank, braced his feet against the base of the machine, and gave a guttural roar that was part prayer and part primal scream. The flywheel groaned, a reluctant, screeching protest of metal on metal. But then, it moved. It didn't spin, but it gave an inch, then 3, then a full rotation as the heated oil finally began to lubricate the cylinder walls. On the 3rd rotation, the Fairbanks Morse gave a hollow, metallic thuff, a puff of white smoke that smelled of 50-year-old ghosts and fresh ether. Caleb didn't stop. He threw his back into the motion, spinning the heavy iron wheel faster and faster, his vision blurring with the effort. Then, with a sound like a 12-gauge shotgun blast echoing through the hollow shed, the engine kicked back, nearly shattering his arm but signaling that the spark had found its home. A second later, the shed was filled with a rhythmic, low-frequency thump, thump, thump that you didn't just hear, you felt in your marrow. The Fairbanks Morse had woken up, its massive external governor spinning like a top, its brass oilers dripping with a steady, mechanical heartbeat. The floorboards vibrated with a power that felt more alive than anything Caleb had ever owned. He looked at the voltmeter on the ancient control panel, watching as the needle slowly climbed out of the red and settled into a rock-steady 240 volts. He had the power, but now he had to figure out how to bridge the gap between this relic and the high-tech wiring of his modern barn without burning the whole thing to the ground. The connection was a nightmare of heavy-gauge copper and manual bypasses, a desperate umbilical cord Caleb had fashioned years ago during a moment of foresight he'd almost forgotten. He dragged the cables through the deepening drifts, his breath coming in white plumes that were instantly snatched away by the howling May wind. He bypassed the digital interlocks of the Titan system entirely, cutting into the main bus bars with the grim determination of a surgeon in a field hospital, knowing that one wrong move would send 4,800 volts through his chest. When he finally threw the manual transfer switch, the Fairbanks Morse didn't just take the load, it leaned into it with a guttural, satisfied roar that echoed off the frozen hills. The lights in the calving barn didn't just flicker, they surged to life with a warm, amber brilliance that cut through the blizzard like a lighthouse, casting a long, defiant beam across the whiteout conditions of the Nebraska flats. Inside the barn, the silence was replaced by the low, steady hum of the infrared lamps and the powerful drone of the ventilation fans, which immediately began to pull the deadly moisture and ammonia out of the rafters. The heifers, which had been huddled in a shivering mass of dark silhouettes, began to settle, their panicked lowing softening as the radiant heat touched their hides. It was a mechanical resurrection that should have been impossible, a victory of analog grit over digital frailty that felt like a shift in the very axis of the world. Just as the first infrared bulb reached full temperature, a pair of ghost-like headlights appeared in the swirling snow, creeping up the driveway with agonizing slowness. It was Rick Vance, a neighboring rancher who had spent the last 3 years at the local equipment diner, telling anyone who would listen that Caleb Miller was farming with one foot in the grave because of his obsession with vintage iron. Vance had lost his own high-tech power grid an hour ago and had seen the glow from Caleb's barn through his binoculars, convinced he was witnessing a structural fire. He climbed out of his truck, his face a mask of disbelief as he stood in the doorway of the machine shed, watching the 1954 Fairbanks Morse hammer away with rhythmic, unstoppable precision. The machine was vibrating the very earth beneath Vance's boots, its external push rods dancing in a blur of mechanical motion, its brass fittings gleaming under the flickering shop light. Vance didn't say a word at first. He just stared at the voltmeter, then at the cables running out into the storm, and finally at Caleb, who was covered in a mixture of black grease, snow, and sweat. The skeptic who had mocked the boat anchor was now standing in its shadow, his own modern tractors sitting dead and cold in his sheds, realizing that the man he'd called a dinosaur was the only one in the county with the lights on. The reputation shift was instantaneous and wordless. Vance reached out a gloved hand and touched the vibrating cast iron block of the generator, a gesture that was almost reverent, acknowledging a form of reliability that his own million-dollar fleet couldn't provide. By the time Silas, the foreman, came running from the barn with a wild grin on his face to report that the first 3 calves were on the ground and breathing easy, the story was already writing itself. Vance didn't just see a running engine. He saw the survival of the Miller legacy and the total collapse of his own arguments. He offered Caleb a silent nod, a surrender of his previous arrogance, and asked if there was room in the barn for a few of his own struggling heifers. Caleb didn't hesitate. The rivalry that had simmered for a decade was snuffed out by the shared realization that when the world goes dark, the only thing that matters is what actually works. The news of the Miller miracle began to ripple through the local CB radios and emergency frequencies, as other ranchers, stranded and freezing, heard that there was a beacon of heat and light in the middle of the storm. The man they had laughed at for keeping a shrine to junk was suddenly the most important person in the township, holding the line against a disaster that had brought the rest of the 21st century to its knees. When the sun finally broke over the horizon on that second day of May, it didn't reveal a landscape of defeat, but a scene of quiet, steam-filled triumph. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world draped in a deceptive, sparkling white silence that was broken only by the steady, rhythmic thump of the Fairbanks Morse still hammering away in the shed. Inside the calving barn, the temperature had stabilized into a comfortable, life-sustaining warmth, and 47 healthy calves, each one a miracle of persistence and cast-iron reliability, were tucked into the dry straw, their ears flicking as they nursed for the first time. Caleb stood by the main gate, his face blackened with grease and his hands shaking from a cocktail of exhaustion and adrenaline, watching the steam rise off the backs of the herd. The 47th calf, a spindly-legged bull that had nearly been lost to the cold in the middle of the night, was now standing on its own, a living testament to a machine built 3 decades before Caleb was even born. The financial ruin that had loomed over the Miller Ranch like a terminal diagnosis had been held at bay, not by a high-speed processor or a satellite-linked sensor, but by the raw, unyielding physics of a heavy flywheel and the stubbornness of a man who refused to let his legacy be dictated by a service contract. The moment of total clarity came 3 hours later, when the county plows finally cleared the path for a sleek, white service truck embossed with the Titan Series logo to roll into the driveway. A technician in a clean jumpsuit stepped out, clutching a diagnostic tablet like a shield, and began to explain that the communication fault had been resolved remotely via a secondary cellular backup, and that the modern generator was now ready to be reset. He looked at the old machine shed, where the Fairbanks Morse was finally being throttled down by Caleb's hand, its massive iron heart coming to a slow, sighing halt after 36 hours of continuous labor. The technician started to speak about the voided warranty and the unauthorized bypass of the digital control module, but Caleb just held up a hand, his eyes cold and clear. He didn't care about the fine print or the logic boards anymore. He realized that the $20,000 module was a tether designed to keep him dependent, a high-tech leash that had almost cost him everything he loved. He told the man to pack up his tools and take the Titan with him. He wasn't interested in a machine that required permission from a corporate server just to keep a calf from freezing to death. The lesson was etched into the very grease under his fingernails. True ownership isn't about what you buy, it's about what you can fix when the rest of the world stops turning. The fallout of the May storm rippled across the county for months, but for the Miller Ranch, it was the beginning of a restoration that went far beyond machinery. Caleb didn't just keep the old Fairbanks Morse, he made it the centerpiece of a new philosophy of self-reliance, spending his evenings teaching the younger generation of ranchers how to listen to the language of valves and magnetos. The bridge loan was paid off in full that autumn, the 47 calves growing into the strongest yearlings the ranch had ever produced, their presence a constant reminder of the night the grid failed and the old iron held the line. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing your survival isn't outsourced to a cloud-based algorithm or a technician 50 miles away. It's the peace of mind that comes from a machine you can understand, a tool you can touch, and a legacy that is held together by bolts and sweat rather than codes and keys. As the sun set over the Nebraska plains, Caleb sat on the bumper of his truck, looking at the 1954 generator through the open shed door, knowing that as long as that iron was in the barn, the millers weren't going anywhere. If you had to choose between a machine that thinks for you and a machine that works for you, which one would you trust with your family's future? Tell me in the comments, have you ever had an old piece of iron save your skin when the modern tech failed?